Welcome everybody, my name is Paul. I'm a real estate professional in the western part of Virginia, and my specialty is rural property and homesteading and land and recreational type property. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about small scale housing, alternative housing. Is very popular today. There's actually a very great demand for it because a lot of the young people, my sons included, they don't really want a huge house. They like to live close to land. And there's a lot of young people these days who feel the same way. They want to be raising their children around where they can have a dog and some open space, and they don't have to travel very far to have a park-like setting. It's right there with them, and maybe they get the children to interact with some animals and grow up and have a very kinesthetic type of a growing up. So homesteading is that way of lifestyle that has been very popular. And of course, the housing question comes into play because here, for example, in Virginia, it was the pioneer area. People came here, like so many places in the country, there was nothing. They had to just find a piece of land and maybe cut down some trees and build some kind of a house there. And if you look around in some areas of the country, you can still see some of those really old log homes that may be 200 years old, and they're still sitting there. And if you think about the modern ways of construction, you see these so-called McMansions, and boy, I don't know, I don't think they'll last 200 years. So for a lot of people, it's very costly to make your home. And if you haven't traveled much in the world, you'll see that many places in the world, they live in such a very different way than in America. You see, we have this banks and so on, and you're supposed to go down and get a loan and pay for this house for 30 years and pay interest on it, and then it's so expensive when you buy it. By the time you pay it off, it's like 3 times the amount when you bought it. And it's a very complex process. So in the housing, people growing up, they don't have much income, or maybe people are retiring, they really don't want a big house, they want to simplify. They look for the various options that may be some alternative, something simpler, something cheaper, mainly cheaper, that they don't have to manage so much, but makes it comfortable housing. So let's start with the really primitive. There are people like my young son, and he just loves the outdoor life. I mean, he could just build a little hut in the woods and live like a monk almost. Some people are like that. They just love it. That's their lifestyle. So let's start with that. We have a little book here called Practicing Primitive. And it's a fun little book. I reviewed it in another episode. But you can see a little bit about many different kinds of homes that people have lived in around the world. Even here in North America, they had various kinds of huts and so on. So the question when you move out the country, let's say you buy a piece of land. If you want to have a fairly so-called alternative kind of housing, you need to get the right kind of zoning where nobody's going to really bother you. And to get that kind of zoning, you need to go out in the countryside where there's a zoning called, in our area, it's called A2 or A1 agricultural. There's a minimum of 2 acres per household, or in A1 it's 1 acre, but a lot of the A1 land is not really being actively used as 1 acre only. Some of it's actually in forestry. But let's say you buy a piece of land and you say, look, I'm a single guy or whatever, like my son or whatever, I'm going to go live in the country and I'm going to build myself a little hut or something and I'm going to live there and be a pioneer like. Well, as long as you have the right kind of zoning, there are many places in the country, like in Virginia, where it's very common where people once had some land and they built a little cabin there and a hut. They were hunting way up in the hills where I live. There are places like that. You can walk way up in the mountains and you'll find nobody's up there, and maybe someone built a little cabin there on their own land, and they just have a place where they go and take their family camping or Boy Scout camp or something like that. You can do that if you have the right zoning. Now, as long as you satisfy the water problem, let's say you build a little primitive structure, let's say some kind of a hut or something, and you'll need water, of course. So let's say you have a system where you collect some rain and you have a stream or something, and you go down and get the water, and you have that. The one other thing you're really going to need is the equivalent of a septic tank. If you're going to live outside, I mean, if you use the toilet several times a day and days go on, years go on, you're going to run out of places that you didn't use yet. So one way to build a kind of an outhouse, that was the old style, the way people did that. It's very functional as long as you design it right. You make a little building or something called the outhouse, and it was very common in the old days, and there's a sort of a pit there. Now the concept of it is that whatever goes down there slowly decays and goes back and back into the earth, and eventually, you know, sometimes it'll dry out and rain will come sometimes and it'll flood a little bit, but basically is a place where that kind of disposal can happen. Now, as long as it's not too many people using it, if you have a little tent, for example, or a real basic campsite, and you come up there in the summers and you go in your cabin and you use it a few times, and you know, for you stay up there a few weeks a year or something, it's not going to be that big of an issue if you just make a little outhouse. But if you want to raise a little family, maybe have a child, and you're going to be using it frequently, then you're going to need something a little more sophisticated than just an outhouse. And that comes into play where I met a guy one time who was selling, he lived in this mobile home, and it was like a 20, 30 foot mobile home. And he'd lived there for 10 years, and the only septic tank that he had was two 55-gallon drums below the house. It was all laid out with gravel and whatever, and for 10 years, he and his up to two kids, I think it was, they lived there, and they used this very extremely simple, primitive type of disposal system. So you can do that. Now, there's engineering ways. That's how they started years ago in pioneering. If you do it properly and carefully with the right type of land, then it can actually function, especially if there's only a small number of people that use it. If you start getting a large family and a lot of guests, then of course you have a different issue. So I want to go through a little bit of the different types of housing. If you go from the simple hut that pictures I showed you, a simple hut construction, a yurt. Investigate yurts. A yurt is in Mongolia, and to start in Mongolia, they have these circular type of things. It's like basically a lattice that goes around. They put the cover over it, and if you look up on YouTube, you'll see them setting them up in Mongolia. They set them up pretty quickly, and they make them all warm inside, and it's amazing what they can do with them. But there's modern companies that produce these yurts. There's one in Virginia called Blue Ridge Yurts, and you can get as small as an 8 foot, well, 10 foot is about the minimum, but 18 foot, or you go up to 30 feet or more, and you can actually combine them. And the tax ways, land is taxed according to the structure, the property tax. So if you have just raw land, the taxing is not going to be very much. If you have raw land and you put a little hunting cabin on there with a little outhouse or something, the taxes on that kind of land are very, very small. The same way if you build a yurt. A yurt is a much more complicated structure, but you put it on a platform, and it's very inexpensive when compared to modern building structures, because for the same amount of dollar per, you can get a lot more square footage. So let's say, I think it was like a 30-foot yurt has like, what's pi r squared, you can figure out the number of square feet that's in a large yurt. Now, if you can put up a yurt on your property, you can live there rather comfortably for a long, long time, actually, and still pay taxes on what's called a temporary structure, as long as you have the proper septic tank, and maybe you have a well. Or if you don't have a well, you have a water collection system that's a little faucet or something, and a little water heater or something. So those kind of structures are very permissible. I know a property not too far from where I live that has 2 yurts on the property. I've never been down there, but I've driven by a number of times, and they have a platform between them, and you can connect them, and they had, like, I think they had a little greenhouse in the middle. You can have 2 yurts connected. You can have like a cooking house. For example, if you have a multiple use structure property where, for example, in Virginia, 2 acres per house. So let's say you have 10 acres or so on, and you put a few campsites in there, and you share one cooking building where the water is there, there's a shower, bathhouse or something, and you can have a number of people living there, and there are ways to rent them out, and Airbnb and some other ways to get people to come there and do a rustic camping thing and pay you actually money and make your property pay. So that's another way of getting into it. So I had a little list here of the types of properties that are types of structures that you can get. There's an A-frame type. You can look them up on YouTube. A-frame type of structures. They're very, very simple, easy. You put them on a platform. Again, as long as you have, if you had one well on a property, for example, I know of a property, for example, that I sold last year that had a really old house on it that really wasn't up to the snuff to a really fantastic house, but it was functional. It had a septic and a well. Okay, you got electricity, you got well, you got septic, you got a roof, you can deal. And then from there, anybody who camps on that site, they can always use the shower or the bathroom and cook in the house, but they don't have to actually own the house. So you can set up a type of a multiple structure on one property type of situation where you share the costs and you can share a well or so on. In real estate, generally, if you have a full house and you don't share a well, because you can't share a well in most real estate applications unless you're like own the one property together. And when you try to sell it, then if there's one well and two houses, that might be a little bit of an issue when it comes to inspection and so on. So then you can go to platforms. There's dome tents. There's a lot of different kinds of things like that. You can build a platform, and then anyone who camps there on your property, just bring their tent for that weekend or weeks or two, and then just put the tent on the platform where it's up above something, put a little fire pit. You don't have to put it right on the ground where it may be moist. That's why a platform can be very helpful. So again, the zoning and the permissions. If you need permission from a county, let's say you want to have a really low used, infrequent friends and family type of situation where you have a homestead and some land and maybe one yurt and maybe some A-frames, and you happen to have a septic and a well, maybe there's a mobile home on the property or something. So you have that kind of a situation where the county's not going to interfere with just, okay, it's private, it's not attracting like tons of traffic and causing all kinds of commotion in the community. That's one thing. But if you want to go into a place where you have like all year long, there's multiple people pulling in and out, and they're going to be commercial whole things set up there and all that. Now you're talking about a different kind of situation where you can appeal to the county in most counties in rural areas and say, look, I want to have a little campsite and we'll do it all right and everything and get the permissions, but this is what I'm going to do. And they'll tell you some certain things that they require, but they've been basically pretty open in the countries about letting people just make something that brings a little income in and has some housing for some people, because it's in the interest of any community and county to let people live there and attract businesses and so on. So there are things that you can make, like a tent. If you want to make something really rustic, typically you can just do that if you own some own land. If you have some really raw land and there's really nothing there, and all you want to do there is you bring your pals up there and throw up some tents and make a little fire pit or something like that, you're not going to have a problem. And it can be very inexpensive to kind of get on your land if you buy some raw land and you start using it a little bit. Like do some camping there, invite some friends over, bring some vibes there. And then you start clearing things. It's a good idea if you're going to have a home site, any kind of tent site, you'll want a little bit of a clearing around. You don't want a fire hazard. You want branches falling on your little structure, even if it's just a small hut. So there's that kind of thing that you think about. If you have a certain kind of property, where one I sold last year, there's 45 acres, and there happened to be like an old logging road up the hill, and sometimes you don't even find that. If you have a logging road or something already on your property, that's really a bonus. And then you can make other kinds of trails. If you have sufficient land, you can make all kinds of little walking trails, or maybe people who are into hunting, they can make a deer stand or something in some areas, and so on. So this video is a bit about small structures and independent type of housing. Again, a mobile home on its own lot is a really good place to start if you want a homestead. I made another video about that. Sometimes you can buy a property, an old farm that's gone downhill a little bit, and you say, look, I know, the owners may be old, they may be just ready to pass it on, and you come and say, look, I know it's kind of decrepit a little bit, but I'm going to take care of it and put some good vibes here and bring it back to life. Sometimes the seller will be very amenable to that if you approach it in a very authentic way. You say, look, I'm going to carry on the tradition of this beautiful homestead that you're trying to sell. So people ask questions for me. I'm a scout. I go around the rural parts of Virginia, my specialty, and I'm a licensed agent. I work for a broker in Moneta, Virginia, near Smith Mountain Lake. I live in the beautiful county of near Rockbridge, near Lexington, Virginia, and it's a lovely area to live. So thanks again for listening. I appreciate all the feedback. Please like and share if you find some value in this content, and I hope to see you in some of my other videos.